Alright guys, welcome back for the second update video for the Bazaar this month, and this one is going to talk more from a game design and mechanic standpoint, what's changed in the last month and a half, and honestly this is where I think most of the progress has been made. It's not so much in the visual side of things in January, it's been more in the high level game design stuff. So I'll just go ahead and kind of jump into it and tell you guys what I've been thinking about and some of the big changes that have been made about how the game will work. So first of all, a lot of you guys are very familiar with deck building games and you'll understand the basics, but for those of you that aren't, I'm going to go ahead and try to explain more or less the basics of the board and the way the mechanics work, just so you can kind of follow along with what I've changed a little bit. So a traditional deck building game, there are hundreds of tabletop deck building games, and there are some mobile ports of deck building games, but there are really no full deck building games that are designed for mobile or digital. They're all basically paper card games that are being ported to mobile with a mobile UI. So a lot of the most famous deck building games that you can find on mobile look a little bit like this. This is Ascension, it's one of the first ones. First one is of course Dominion, but I don't think it has a mobile client. It does have a web client, but not mobile. Ascension does have mobile. Basically this is zoomed in on somebody's discard pile right now, which is what this like intrusive thing, you can ignore all these right here. But the big thing to focus on here are these big cards. These 6 cards in the middle are basically the stores, is what we've been calling them in the Bazaar at least. And these are the cards that both players can, buy from or kill monsters in to get rewards. These up here are the neutrals that either player can go for at any time. These don't ever change. The big ones do change though, right? If you get rid of one, you replace it with another one from the physical stack of cards under it. So there's a specific amount of each of these cards in the stores. And yeah, the game kind of self-corrects because if one strategy is being overdrafted by one player, then the other strategy becomes more open. So I'll get more into that later. But this is basically the idea, right? You have 2 players, they're both buying stuff to add to their deck from the same stores in the middle. And then each turn they're drawing 5 cards. Once their deck runs out, they shuffle the discard pile back into the deck. And, it's just, you endlessly loop your cards between those zones. But you're always buying from these 6 in the middle. So here's Star Realms. This is probably the most polished mobile port of a tabletop deck building game. They did a really good job on this one. So again, same story though, right? You have your 5 stores in the middle here. The big cards, both players can buy from these, and then you have this one neutral thing that never changes. Both players can buy this one at any time. And then you have your discard pile here, your deck here, and that's pretty much it, right? This game has some bases that stay in play, but the mechanic's not important for what I'm going to be talking about today. So again, the big common point in all deck building games that I've noticed is that all players are buying from the same row of cards. And this actually solves an interesting problem because as soon as one player buys something, a new option opens up under that, and the board never clogs up. So let's say there's these red cards are for archetype A, these 2 green cards are for archetype B, and this one's for archetype C, right? So if player 1 goes for A, right, at some point, player B doesn't really want A. Let's say it's mid-game, he hasn't been buying A, he has no interest in these red cards. Well, because the other player's taking them, the board doesn't really clog up as much because, this player can now just go ahead and be buying the stuff that shows up under this once that's purchased. So the middle board's always changing because, one of the 2 players is going to be buying stuff. Ascension, again, older deck building game, has huge issues with the board clogging. A lot of times you just have these unbuyable board states that pop up as early as turn 1. Where neither player can really purchase anything. But again, it has the same benefit of sort of self-correcting where if one player is taking all the cards of a certain type, there's still stuff showing up under that. So there's always more options being presented. So the biggest change that I wanted to make with the Bazaar from day one, 2 years ago when I made the first paper prototype, was I wanted class identity, right? Because the thing about these deck building games is there is no class identity. You're each just a person with the same starting deck buying from the same pool of stuff. So there's not really a lot of room for individuality or personalizing your gameplay or strategy. And I really wanted to incorporate a class-based system, if possible, into a deck building game. So in order to do that, how do you incorporate a class-based strategy? Well, you need to make sure that the stores that you're buying stuff from only have cards for your class, right? So the first thing I did is basically split it like this. So one player gets those 3 stores, the other player gets these 3 stores. And now you can have separate card pools rather than the same one. That's the big benefit. You get more class identity. You let players kind of personalize their play experience more. You help them connect with the class that they like. These 2 things in the corner here would just be the neutrals, just like in all the other games. So this is one thing I wanted to try doing, right? Because then this also ties into how the game monetizes, because if I can isolate pools of cards to a specific class like this, then I can monetize just like League of Legends monetizes, where every 2 months we release a new hero to the game that has his own card pool to buy from, its own play style, its own balance, everything. It'll be fucking broken on release to make you buy it. You didn't hear that from me, though. Basically, all these advantages in separating the stores are pretty strong from like a monetization standpoint, from a gameplay standpoint. So I wanted to do that right off the bat. So I ran into this issue where, let's say you have your stores show up in the beginning of the game and you have like a fire card, an ice card, and a lightning card, right? You have a card for archetype A, B, and C. What ends up happening is, like, let's say you're playing Wizard. This is Wizard, Wizard A archetype is Ice. This is Wizard Fire deck. This is the Wizard Lightning deck, assuming those are archetypes, These cards show up, and let's say you start the game by buying A, right? So A goes away, and a random card shows up to replace A. So, a B card shows up. Hold on, there's going to be memes around this one. A C card shows up. So let's say, okay, I bought an A card. Now in turn 2, I want more A cards to synergize with my, I bought the Wizard Fire card, right? So I want more Fire cards to synergize. Well, now I can't buy one. There's only C and B cards. There's only Ice and Lightning left. But that's fine. Let's say I buy this Ice card, right? So we get the Ice card. That's in our deck now. We bought it. Ice card got replaced with, let's say, like another C card. And all of a sudden, I have this Ice card and this Fire card, and my only options left to buy are Lightning cards, which is really, it makes you feel like you're forced to just buy whatever shows up. And because the board state is kind of clogged like this, you can't really guide your build towards one specific archetype or strategy. So a few weeks ago, we've decided look, we need card velocity. We need to make sure that these stores don't clog up like this and that new options are being presented. So I tried a lot of different mechanics for this. I tried, first of all, a mechanic called Bump, which you guys might have seen in the very earlier videos. Bumping just means replace the store card with a new random card. Basically just knock off the top card. It's a theoretically simple mechanic, right? You could bump your opponent's stuff, mess with their game plan. You could bump your own stuff to unclog your stores. And I was really incentivized to include a lot of bump cards to the game to help mitigate this problem of the stores clogging up. Because again, since your opponent can't buy stuff from your store, only you can, the stores don't automatically refresh themselves the way that they do in a traditional deck building game. So what I found is I don't really like the bump mechanic from a new player standpoint. Like for advanced players, it is pretty interesting. There's a lot of depth in whether to knock off your opponent's card here, or get rid of this card that's not going to be too useful, so you have one more option. There's actually a lot of options with the bump mechanic, but if you're a new player, new to the game, you jump in, you have to read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right off the bat, you have to read 8 cards, understand what they do. Keep in mind, some of these cards generate other cards, right? They're like multi-stage cards. So you're like hovering over a tooltip trying to grasp what this card does. The clock is ticking down. You haven't even gotten to your own cards yet. It's just a lot to take in. Because when you bump something, when you get rid of a card, you have to quickly look at 8 cards, determine which one's the best option, and that's like very daunting thing to do. Again, we might still include that mechanic. It's very daunting for a new player. You have to really understand what you're doing a lot. It's a mechanic that becomes fun once you're like 30 hours in, but it's not very accessible. So I don't know if I want to make it a core mechanic. I mean, in the current build, we have it in the starting decks, just to include the card velocity, like a card that bumps just in the decks you start with. But I'm, still on the fence whether it's a mechanic worth having in the long run. Anyway, besides bump, because I'm so on the fence about bump, what other solution could we find for this issue of stores clogging up, right? If I want to draft the fire deck, how am I going to be sure that, my stores aren't going to clog up with ice cards? We don't want people to be able to force drafting the fire deck, but if your stores just kind of clog up, you feel kind of at the mercy of what shows up, because you're not really selecting from 3 possible options. You're just kind of buying whatever to get to the card under it, and the gameplay loop just doesn't feel that good then. One solution that we came up with that we think is probably what we'll do is basically a day and night cycle. That's a sun and a moon. So basically the idea is, you have your card A, B, and C. You start your turn. It's the day. You buy card C. Right? You buy this one. It gets replaced with card A. And you end your turn. Right? You buy your card. You pass the turn. Turn comes back to you. All of a sudden, it's not day anymore. Now it's night. Now that it's night, it's still the same cards in the store. So you go ahead and you buy one more. You buy your B card, right? So you have a C and a B. You're not really interested in A this time around. And all of a sudden, you pass the turn back to your opponent. Your opponent takes their turn. And now it's back on you. And what happens on your turn? Well, it goes back to daytime. And since it's a new day, the shopkeepers change, right? So now, since it's a new day, automatically all the stores get refreshed, right? These A's get replaced with random cards. This card in the middle, whatever it was, gets replaced. This one gets replaced. So now the stores are auto-rotating all of them every other turn. And this basically means that, let's say you're seeing like AAC then showing up in the next pool. And again, I'm choosing letters to denote cards that fall into a certain archetype or strategy. Not all cards do, but, just hypothetically speaking. So, now I can get my C card because my board didn't clog up. It got refreshed. So now I have 2 C cards and I'm kind of progressing my archetype further. This kind of mechanic prevents the stores clogging up, which is really the big problem that becomes introduced once you separate the stores into being player-specific stores. One other benefit we miss out on compared to a traditional deck building game is the fact that the game doesn't self-correct as much. The nice thing about having a shared pool that players are drafting from is that the game self-balances. Because let's say that, strategy A is like 25% stronger than strategy B, right? Well, if everybody's trying to do strategy A cards are going to be overdrafted. There's not going to be enough of them. So strategy B becomes more abundant. You can get more things that synergize with it. And all of a sudden, just because of the metagame of the way people prioritize cards, a weaker strategy all of a sudden becomes stronger than it should be because it's more readily available. And you see this in all games with a shared pool. You see it in all deck building games that share stores. You see this even in games like Auto Chess that have a shared pool of units. And, the one thing about the Bazaar is we don't have this benefit. We do have the benefit in some capacity. We don't have this benefit in these main stores because they're player specific. But, despite all of that, I think the benefits outweigh the negatives when it comes to separating the stores. I do think it's the way to go. And when it comes to these neutral piles that both players have access to, that's where that self-balancing element will still come into play. These are going to be the cards both players are contesting. So for a long time in testing, what we had is 3 neutral stores. And this one would be a silver coin that makes 2 money. And what I basically did is we wanted to take advantage of the fact that we're digital. And because we're digital, we get to do things that other deck building games just don't get to do. So what we did is we implemented turn-based card spawning. So in a normal deck building game, all of these cards that are showing up in these middle stores are from the same stack of cards, right? There's only going to be like 2 of these moonworms that show up, or there's only going to be 1 of these orb of nixes that shows up in the entire pool. And this is, in a longer game, you kind of self-balance that way because you're never going to run into like 10 of these and have something crazy happen because of that. But the Bazaar is digital, right? So we don't have a physical deck of cards that we're limited to spawning things in the store from. Instead, it works more like an MMO loot table. So there's different drop rates for different cards, and the really big mechanic that we get, I think maybe the most important mechanic from being digital, is turn-based card spawning. So basically, we get to decide what turn certain cards can spawn. If you look at a game like Ascension, for example, on this board, you have a monster that has 7 health, 8 health, a card that costs 7 to buy, 8 to buy, 8 to buy. Keep in mind, on the first few turns of the game, maximum you're going to have 5 money. So you can't buy anything, you can't kill anything. So it's not uncommon to get these board states where, as a player in a traditional deck building game, a bunch of stuff comes into play and you just can't buy anything because the board's clogged up, because it's just pure randomness out of that stack of cards. Maybe you have let's say 3 cards that are too expensive to be bought. So the players buy these other 3 cards and then they get replaced by something really expensive. And all of a sudden the stores just clog up. So even though at a glance it looks like you have 6 options, if you only have access to 5 money to attack, you have access to no options, right? Or you have access to only 2 options. You can only buy what you can afford. One of the big benefits of this turn-based spawning system that we're going to have is, we're not going to be spawning a card that costs 8 on turn 1. That's just a very simple example. But on the flip side of that, let's say you have a card that generates a resource like money. Those kinds of cards are very good to buy early in deck building games, but late game, they're pretty much useless because your deck's already built a lot. You have to wait till you draw the coin, play the coin, buy a card with it, draw the card that you bought. Basically things that produce money, or whatever they call it in Ascension, Mystics, this triangle-y resource. Cards that do that are bad in the late game. So in the Bazaar, we can just have those cards stop spawning, after the mid game, And that actually introduces more decision making into the game because, now all 3 of your options are going to be at least playable for the point of the game that you're at. So you're not stuck in this situation where like 2 of your cards are completely unbuyable, but then the 3rd card is buyable, and you're forced to buy it, right? If you don't have a decision in that scenario, you're just buying the one thing you can. And that's really the feeling I want to avoid, is just this feeling of being like locked out and left without options. It's really fun when you can afford all of your options, and the person that makes the better decisions will end up winning more often with that. So, why are neutral resources in these games at all? Well, it's because sometimes the board state clogs up, and that is why these neutral things are available. There's always mystics that you can buy, endless amount of them. There's always heavy infantry. There's always explorers that you can buy in Star Realms. Why are they there? Well, it's on the off chance that the center row is full of stuff that's just completely unbuyable. If the stuff is unbuyable, then both players spend a few turns buying these resources, which will build how much money you can make in one turn on average, and eventually somebody gets to buy a really big thing and break the game open and start opening up the board. In a digital deck building game, again, because of turn-based card spawning, because we don't have to worry about these unbuyable board states, we don't have a reason to include this neutral coin pile. Instead, we took a note from Hearthstone. We basically did hero powers for each class, again, to give them a little bit more class identity. And those hero powers are going to give each player a custom ability specific to them that you can do if you have excess mana, or just kind of tie into your turn if it makes sense. We are still going to have these neutral piles, but they're both going to be monsters. So both of these are neutral monsters that either player can kill. Anyway, day and night cycle, turn-based card spawning. These are 2 of the bigger developments. More recently, I want to talk about the way that combat and attacks are going to work. Because let's say that I have a card that is really neat sword card, and sword card is going to give me +2 attack. Well, in a traditional deck building game, whether Star Realms or Ascension, and this is what we started out with as well, what you would basically do is you'd play your combat card, in this case, let's say like heavy infantry in this game, and you get 2 attack. That attack just floats in a pool of attack right here. So right now he has 1 attack in his pool. Star Realms, same thing. You play your coin cards, you play your attack cards. They get added to your total coin and attack for the turn, and then afterwards you decide how to distribute it. Now what we found is it's 2 things. It's unintuitive, it's bad from a feedback mechanism response, and it just doesn't feel as good as the new method that we're going to do now. So basically, let's say I play my sword card. I spent all my coins to buy the sword. When I bought the sword, it goes to my discard pile. I had to wait until I drew the sword after my discard pile shuffled back into my deck. Basically, I buy it. I have to wait 3 turns to draw it. And when I finally get to play the sword, all it does is it changes a number on the board. And then I have to choose how to split that. It's just a weird feeling. It's unintuitive. When you play a sword, it should feel like you're playing a sword. There should be a hit animation. You should pick what you're attacking. We have this issue with monsters as well. Let's say you have a monster that has 2 HP, and monster, he has horns, he's very evil and angry. Monster has 2 HP. So you play a couple swords, you have 4 attack in your pool, and you go to attack this monster. Well, what we found is that players that are new to deck building games thought that it would overkill. They thought that all 4 attack would go to this monster. Let's say you play a really big sword that gives you 4 attack, right? And you then go to attack this monster. In a traditional deck building game, you would lose 2 attack. Like you can split damage, So you would kill the monster, you'd be left with 2 attack left over. We found that was very unintuitive. And most players expected to overkill monsters, actually. And it's something that almost every player felt was more intuitive, especially the ones that did not have a deck building game background already. And then I thought further along to when we have animations in the game, Let's say I play the sword card. The only animation you get, like all that changes when you play the sword card with the traditional system, is just that value. So you play it, your attack value goes up by 2, but there's no slashing animation unless you delay it to when you distribute the damage. It's just messy, right? You want to have immediate visual feedback when you do something in a video game. Like if I play the sword, I want to see the slash right then and there. I don't want to wait another 20 seconds till I finish doing my stuff and then distribute damage to see a slash. It's not satisfying. It's not intuitive. We can do better. So we basically changed the entire way combat works. And the way it's going to work now is, let's say you have a monster and your monster is going to have, hold on, let's make him scary here. Your monster is going to have 6 health. And you have a weapon that has 3 attack, right? You have your sword. Your sword's gonna generate 3 attack. So when you play the sword, right away you have to target. Like as you play the sword, you have to target what you're hitting. Are you gonna smork your opponent's hero portrait and do damage directly to them? Or are you going to attack this monster? If you attack the monster, it's going to do 3 damage to it right away. You see the slash right away. You get the animation, the sound effect right when you play the card. Monster goes down to 3 health, and you can finish killing it next turn. You can play another weapon to kill it now. We considered having the monsters re-heal to full health at the end of every turn, kind of the way that they do in Magic. But because we have these neutral monster stacks over here on the left, the neutral monsters actually have a pretty interesting metagame behind them if you don't let the monsters heal. Let's say we have like a really big boss and one of these neutral monsters has like 12 HP. Well, neither player can take it down in one turn. So you basically have to make the decision, okay, maybe I'll do like 6 damage to it right now and try to finish it off next turn. And then the other guy takes his turn. You have to think about, well, what if he can finish it off and get the really big reward? So it creates this interesting tension that I think is fun. It'll be cool to explore how that mechanic works. If you know that your opponent has things like bump type of mechanics or things that can change your stores, committing to killing a monster over 2 turns becomes a lot more of a high risk, high reward play. Some monsters will have so much HP that they'll take a full 2 turns to kill, in which case, again, they're really vulnerable to disruption, right? Because if you commit a bunch of resources trying to kill this monster and then your opponent messes with that store, it could lose you the game potentially. So just an interesting thing to think about. I think the new combat system will feel more satisfying, more intuitive, more rewarding. I think it's just better. One thing I forgot to mention earlier when I talked about the day and night cycle is it's not just a means of refreshing the stores. It's a method of incorporating new mechanics into the game, because from a design standpoint, for example, I was having trouble with the vampire class. It used its life as a resource, but I found that a lot of the things that are vampire themed are very blood related or very gory. It's grotesque, right? It's like sucking the blood out of people, killing them, ritual sacrifice, coffins, daggers. Like, it's really dark, morbid stuff for a game that I want to be relatively kid friendly. So it didn't really fit, at least not traditional vampiric lore. So the beauty of the day and night cycle is it lets us introduce a mechanic like Nocturnal, where the cards are more effective during the night phase, on turns that are night turns rather than day turns. And I think that's great. I think it's a great way to rework Vampire into being not just more kid-friendly, but honestly more interesting to play with. Because the whole trade your life for resources was not as exciting as you might expect. We'll still have cards that do that. It's just that I think the Nocturnal theme is a much more fitting one, and I think the day-night cycle that I talked about opens us up to doing that more. So those are really the big changes. Turn-based spawning, new combat system. Hasn't really been done in a deck-building game before, to my knowledge. I think it'll be the best one for digital. And let me kind of jump into how this new turn-based spawning thing will affect card design. So if you guys remember earlier, I recorded a video that you can see on my channel about archetypes in card game design. I think it was called something like that. And I basically did this Venn diagram, I think it's called, where I talked about, archetype A, B, and C, the hybrid cards that fit into archetype A and B, these neutral cards in the middle that fit into everything. And this is still a reasonable outline for overall archetypes and strategies within a class. But this is not a very useful tool for designing cards. It's not a useful tool for gameplay. What this is like a sorting tool to make sure that there's roughly the same number of cards within each archetype. So now that we have turn-based spawning, it really changes the way card design happens, because now it's no longer a deck building game where you just design all these cards that have synergies if they're played with the other cards of their faction, or they're not just cards that are all good in a vacuum. Turn-based spawning lets us do really situational effects, right? Like, we can do an effect that removes a weapon from your opponent's deck in the late game, or one that just has some really niche effect that's only good really late in the game or mid game. So the way that this affects card design is also very different, because now everything is turn-based, right? So if everything is turn-based, the game design looks more like what I think would be like a flow chart. So each row would be, let's say each row is like a turn. So the top row is for cards that can spawn on turn 1. Second row is for cards that can spawn on turn 2, etc., etc. So now, I think the way we design cards now, and this is the format we'll be using moving forward, we'll make a chart like this for each archetype. So for archetype A, we can go ahead and create this flow chart basically, where on turn 0, what cards can spawn in the store. Well, for archetype A, let's say it's the fire archetype. So on turn 0, you can see Pyromancer's Coin, you can see Sweltering Staff, you can see Pyromancer's Cloak, you can see Transmutation, you can see Pyrology. And these are, you know, there'll be, let's say, 10 options that can show up on turn 0. A critical breakpoint becomes turn 3, because if your starting deck is full of 10 cards that do not cycle, and you're drawing 5 cards per turn, you won't see any of the cards that you've purchased in the first couple turns until turn 3. So turn 3 is basically like the second phase of buying, where you're finally starting to draw some of the stuff that you bought in these earlier phases. So now this is the critical breakpoints. Now you're going to see a big difference in cards that are spawning. You're going to see more mid-sized weapons. You're going to see cards that can cost 6 gold start to show up, because now the player is expected to be able to afford 6 gold cards, whereas on turn 0, 1, or 2, there's a 0% chance that they can afford cards that cost 6, because they haven't had the opportunity to draw their bigger money-making cards yet. But yeah, starting turn 3, now you see mallets showing up, all of these kinds of things. You get all the way to turn 8, all of a sudden these cards from turn 0 are removed from the pool. They will no longer be showing up, because at this stage of the game, they're just not reasonable choices. So they're just going to be not an option for either player. So it makes the game less interesting if they're showing up, because then you'll have 2 options instead of 3. Some of these will basically link into each other and fork off into different archetypes or sub-archetypes. And you basically create more of like a lightning pattern rather than a Venn diagram. And this is kind of the way that I think I'm going to be doing class design moving forward, because I think that the turn-based nature of the cards being designed is so much more useful than the Venn diagram thing. And all of these cards will still fit within a Venn diagram, right? Like archetype A, this is essentially the top circle in that Venn diagram. The top circle here is this grid. Within it, you're going to have some of the hybrid AB archetype cards that fit into both circles. This little sliver here. Anyway, I hope that kind of gives you guys an idea of the way I'm approaching card design moving forward. I think these are very big developments, even if they might not seem like it. And I think that they're going to be pretty revolutionary for the deck building game world. I think this is the kind of stuff that makes a night and day difference between digital versus paper deck building games. This is the kind of thing that paper deck building games just cannot do under any circumstances. And it's just such a massive advantage. The game just becomes so much more fun when we can do stuff like this. One other little benefit I wanted to mention, or not really a benefit, this is like an offshoot thing we noticed. We had a bunch of cards in the game that when you play them, they would say, let's say potions as an example. When you play this card, add a potion to your discard pile. So there were these cards that get added to your deck, and when you play them, they would add more cards to your deck. And one thing we noticed with this design is that getting a card that you bought from the store takes a really long time. Like, you buy the card from the store, it goes to your discard pile. You have to then wait for your deck to run out. Then you have to shuffle your discard into your deck. Then you have to wait to draw the card you bought. And all of a sudden, like 4 turns later, you finally get to play with this card that you bought. And I still have to ask myself if that mechanic alone is just a relic of the past, and maybe we should just have, maybe a card that you buy should just go to your hand right away, and we just rebalance the game around that or something. But that aside, what we notice with these cards that add stuff to your discard pile is that when you buy them and you wait such a long time to finally draw them, and then when you finally play them, the only thing that happens is you add more stuff to your discard pile that you have to wait to draw. That's really unfun, because it's a lot of waiting for the payoff, like a little too much waiting, and just getting like an immediate serotonin hit is just way more fun. So what we realized is all of these cards that would add stuff to your deck when played repeatedly needed to put the card into your hand right away, just like as a mechanic. So all cards that used to just add stuff to your deck have been reworked to add stuff to your hand immediately. That just makes them a lot more fun to play with. So I think this is also a really big change. And it's just another one I wanted to mention. So none of these things might seem that flashy, and they're really hard to explain in a YouTube video. But trust me when I say these are like very, very big game design changes, and I think that they'll make the game significantly better. They're really exciting changes. Like, I'm more excited about these changes than seeing like a new game board or anything like that, because this will fundamentally change how the game plays and feels and is designed. So yeah, I'm excited about it. Let me know what you guys think. If you have suggestions or inputs, please let me know. Thanks for following the project. Thanks for following along. I hope I'm not revealing too much stuff in these videos, because it makes it a lot easier to copy us, but here's hoping that doesn't happen. Anyway, until next time, guys, appreciate the support. I'll see you soon.